Okay, we have a fairy tale astrology video. Basically, the members of fairy tale and their zodiac signs. Starting with our MC, Natsu Dragoneel. Guess what he is? He's a Cancer of the second decan. So he is born July 7th. He's a very emotional guy when it comes to his guild. When they get hurt, right? They're basically his family. You know, Makara found him when he was like 10 years old. He had nowhere to go. And he was like, you can join this guild. You know, you're not the only child that was orphaned by whatever. You know, we open our doors to people who want to learn magic. And, you know, this guild is, you know, about taking care of each other. And he take that shit seriously, you know. He might fight with his guildmates here and there, but, you know, that's just the way it is. And then when, you know, Phantom Lord comes through, he's like, you know, really like, damn, they're destroying the guild hall, you know. They, you know, beat down some of my guildmates, and it just pisses him off to no end. He just gets loud, and he's like, I'm gonna fuck these guys up. I don't even give a fuck. I'm looking for the guild master, and I'm gonna try to fight him myself. He ends up fighting Gajeel instead. But like anytime his guild's in danger and shit, he's like, no, I don't want this guild to. I want to lose my guildmates. I don't want to lose anybody. You know, anybody I really care about. So he fights even harder, right? He definitely gets amped by that, you know, power of friendship type stuff. You know, and it's pretty obvious with him. The next person, right, is Lucy Hartfilia. She's also a Cancer, but she was born July 1st. See, the difference between her and Natsu is she's of the first decan Cancers, right? So she is more emotional, intuitive, but she's like, you know, she ain't gonna like fight right away. You know, she ain't about throwing hands right away. Those like second decon, you know, Cancers, they get to scrapping if they're like some guys, right? Even the females do too. But these bitches won't do that shit right away. You know, they'll take some time still. They're a little more passive. But they still have the effect of like affecting other people, like because Cancer initiates emotions in other people, right? So basically, she does that, and she does do that. So basically, she's like, "Oh my God, we're losing, and all these people are fighting, and I wish I had more power to help them out, but I'll use what little power I have to help fight, the good fight." And she's doing that shit, in different situations. And then it's like, certain people see her and they're like, damn, Lucy's crying. She's getting all, passionate and emotional about this shit. You know, we're going to fight even harder because she, you know, like, why is she the one, getting all, emotional about this shit? She's only been here for, not as long as us. She cares about the guild and like we're her fucking family and shit, and she has that same deep kind of care that Natsu does, and as the series progresses she gets more like that and shit. She's starts to fight better and other things, but she's more of a person who she's affecting other people, making them want to fight harder for the guild, making them realize like, hey, this is my guild too. Like I grew up in this fucking guild. Why ain't I? And they fight harder because of that. And they're like, she helps them realize that shit. And she's like one of those kind of Cancers. You know, open your eyes. This is your home too. Erza is an Aries. She was born April 7th. Yeah, she's the warrior. She's Titania the warrior, right? The queen of the fairies, right? She is always about, taking charge. She takes charge. She's going on missions. People like even fear her. They don't want to piss her off because they know they will get fucked up by this girl. She doesn't know how to hold back sometimes. She don't. Even when she's like, throwing light punches, they're like, oh fuck, she almost broke my arm. Being, the kind of energy she has, Aries are very energetic, right? And she's the kind of Aries that is like, I am the white beacon. Basically, she's the beacon of like hope for her guild, and she does show up like that because like when they fought against Uh, this is like a great, example. When they fought against um, the Seven King of Purgatory, she fought against Azuma. Everybody was getting their magic drained, and he was like, "I choose you as the person I want to fight because you are strong, you're powerful. You'll give me a good fight. And if you don't, your guildmates are gonna die." And she's like, "Oh fuck no, I ain't gonna let you, kill my guild members." So she gets on the move and she fights with everything she has. Like every time she fights somebody tough, she like always she puts 110% into that shit. She's like you can't really hate Erza. She's like one of those girls and shit. And she's beautiful too. Um, you know, but can be aggressive, assertive, but she's also a great leader. And that's why they made her the guild master. After um, the year they were gone for a year, and then they came back, and they're like, "We need a guild master," and then they were like, "Erza, Erza, Erza." They just were like, "She's always like keeping us in line, like stop fighting and shit." She's the first one to like break that shit up and be like, "If you keep fighting, I'll smack the shit out of you, and you really won't want to fight no more." You know. Gray Fullbuster. He is born February 13th, so he's an Aquarius of the later degrees. So this guy, he's smart. And he like can be cold sometimes. But he's like, he don't want to get too close because like this guy, you know, he's had, his, past and other things, but even through all that, he tries not to, get too cry why about that shit. He just, takes shit, like just like an Aquarius, he can take the information, see the like real facts, you know. Usually he's not starting shit. So when it comes to him and Natsu fighting, it's usually not him, saying anything. Like sometimes he does say some smart shit because like Aquarius does that. Like they'll say some like true shit, and then somebody gets hurt, or Natsu might, bring up a remark about his clothes, and he's like, oh, but he understands he has those tendencies because he was trained by Ur, and she was his teacher, and and it's something that just stuck with him, and he's like, it's just one of those weird things, and it is fucking weird, why do you have to shriek every time? And Aquarius is a little bit, weird, and it's unpredictable too. Happens, whenever. Now, when he has this relationship with, Juvia, he's cool to her. He's like not really trying to, get too close. Like he can talk to her a little bit, like when she's like, not too, obsessed with him, like, sexually or wanting to be like touchy feely around him. And he's like, yeah, I just not right now. He's like distant and tries to do that. But he also does that to protect her because he knows, and he doesn't want to, he doesn't want to show that vulnerable side too much. And he does eventually. And when he does, he just like, it's like, damn, I wasn't strong enough for my friends. And Aquarius is like, when they have friends, like real friends, they like that. They're like that. They'll get upset at themselves and other things. They'll be like, I could have done better for them. I could have, you know. And then when it comes time for, the fight for Zeref, right? With Zeref, he was like, I ain't gonna tell anybody shit because I know that's gonna get them all like, oh no, Gray, don't do that. Because he's like, I'll put him in an ice shell and then like they won't even know I existed because of how the spell works. And then Zeref's defeated and nobody has to worry about it. I don't care, I really don't give a fuck. Let's just get this shit over with. Let's get this guy. He's done. He's frozen for another 100 years. We don't have to deal with him. And Fairy Tail gets to live, and that's good enough for me. He's a true friend like that. Now, Wendy Marvel, she was born February 27th, so she is a Pisces. She's a little bit of an emotional one too. Yeah. She gets creative with her magic. She developed a spell, right, that was able to cure the motion sickness for dragon slayers, and her being a dragon slayer too, she's like, I want to help you guys out. You're my guild mates. Let me do this for you. And it only works temporary, but she was like, considerate, compassionate towards her fellow dragon slayers, and she's like, I don't want you guys to, puke your guts out and other things, so let me use this spell on you, the Troy spell. And because they have motion sickness, anytime they're on any kind of vehicle or anything, and they feel like puking and they can't move around, they just get sick. She was able to, hook that spell up, she's very, she's now an enchantress too. These people, right? These Pisces, right? They're very, mysterious and, you know, dreamy, imagination, that kind of thing. So, like, she's a dragon slayer, but on top of that, she's a enchantress. Now, there's not that many enchanters in fairy tale. There's Freed, and there's Irene, and there's her. And then she learned the enchantment magic from Irene. Magical powers, are, crazy. This girl has, great potential, right? But she's, also a girl, so she's, a little bit inexperienced, but she's not afraid to, try to, fight for the guild. She's like, my friends are fighting, so I'm gonna fight too. And she's like, I'll fight as hard as I can. You know, she's kind of affected by everybody around her too. She understands that that's how this guild is and other things, and then that just pours into her, and she's like, "Damn, I gotta fight harder," And I also don't want to lose my cat, so she fights hard like any other dragon slayer who fights with a cat. Her emotions drive her forward to, get the dub. Now, Laxus, Dryer, he's an Aries too, born April 16th. So he is one of those Aries that is, man, he can, get the dub. He has some like Jupiterian energy. So basically, this guy fights against some strong people. You know, he's not the MC. So basically, he was like, at first he's like an Aries, right? So he don't do the slow shit at all. He don't give a fuck. Like his grandfather wasn't running the guild the right way. They looked weak. They care about perception, fire signs too, or like, we're not giving off the aura of a strong guild. We're weak as fuck now because you drove the shit into the ground, so I'm gonna take over. I don't give a fuck. I don't give a fuck. And he starts, really fucking, going after his guildmates. And he doesn't care, and it takes some time before he's like, oh shit, like, and he does, eventually, and he's like, ah shit, maybe I went a little overboard, and you know what? If you have to get rid of me because I'm too, impulsive and aggressive, then that's what it is. And he didn't, get sideways. And he also, he was like, I did this, don't, get them involved. Don't kick them out. Like, Freed and Big So and, them, when they're like truly, they understand they fucked up, they know. They know their self-worth and shit, right? So they're like, they didn't do anything. They were just following me, So you don't have to, penalize them for what I did. And then he comes back and saves them at the right moment. He comes back and he saves them from Hades, and he's fighting Hades, who's like really powerful, right? And he's actually doing damage to him because they, like Natsu, Erza, Gray, Lucy, and Wendy, they didn't do shit to him, right? And then when he gets there, he's putting like belt to ass. Initial attacks are like doing damage, and he's screaming and shit. Like Hades is actually feeling that shit. Eventually, though, like Aries, they can burn out sometimes. So he had to like, But see, here's the thing: he didn't really burn out though. He gave his powers off to Natsu, narratives and all that shit, right? Because Laxus is actually my favorite character, but he also fought against Jura, and they were like, we have to like give that fight to you. You're strong. You can, figure out something against this guy. And these type of Aries can, definitely figure out situations. They're not just, aggressive and, go after it. They like, kind of, you know, they've been in enough, situations to know how to navigate them, you know, and get the dub. So he fought against, Jura, and he's like, this is gonna be tough. I know it is, but I don't give a fuck. I'll, hit him with everything I got. Boom, boom, boom. And they had a good fight, but he ended up winning that one. Aries meet challenges head on. Boom, boom, boom. He didn't cry about having to fight Jura or any of that shit. He was just like, this is gonna be tough, but I'm him, so I can, go in there and do that. And then later on, he's fighting, and he shouldn't be. He's kind of, he's reckless. Aries are reckless too. So he's like, I don't care that I'm injured. I have Bane particles. I'm basically poisoned, and I'm fighting against a demon that poisoned me, who can poison me even more. Not sensible, right? But he's gonna do it regardless because he knows he can win. He's confident in his abilities. This guy is a fucking guy. Anyways, Mirajane, she was born October 22nd. She's a Libra. So she's a Libra, right? So she is one that, used to be, she cared about her brother and sister. She had to take charge and she had to, think about their, futures and shit, right? So she joins Fairy Tale and she's like, I got a demon arm, and like, people were like not accepting us, I want them to be safe. I'm gonna leave and not come back. And they're like, no, sister, don't leave. We got magic like you too. And she was just, being an older sister trying, take care of them. She was even like a little bit, she was kind of a bitch when she was a little girl, but she was going through that phase of like, whatever, right? She would get into fights with Erza and other things, but eventually when her sister died, she like turned a new leaf. She was like not trying to be too aggressive in that way. She, really turned the guild into like her family, and she talks to everybody. She's like, greets them with, pleasant compliments all the time. She's like, hey, so and so, you came back from your mission, do you want a drink? And they're like, nah, but thanks, or yeah, we'll have a drink. She's just greeting everybody and making them feel at home, very welcoming, very, gracious, peaceful. She's a peacemaker in the guild. Where Erza is like that, Aries energy, and she'll, you know, deliver the punishment when, need be. She's the one that's like, oh, well, she's, this way and that way, but, we're all still guild mates, and, it's, just the way it is, and, she greets them, she, cares about them, she's, very kind, you know, and she is, and that's what she's described as. And then she's also very aesthetically pleasing. So she was in, Sorcerer Weekly, as one of like, she was the like best bitch they had on there. She was always on the front. And then like some other bitch took over, and then like 7 years later in the tournament, she was like, they were like, oh, Mirajane Strauss, she's back, and they're like, oh, she, still looks as, bad as she ever did, right? Elfman May. Now he's a Taurus, but unlike me, he was born of the third decan, so he was born May 5th, or not May 5th, May 18th. He was born May 18th. So this guy is about getting to that shit right away. He's gonna prove his strength, right? He's gonna do that shit, right away. He ain't gonna waste any time, right? He has a better sense of urgency. Now I ain't saying he's, because he's like that. Like he would go into his, demon form and, fuck shit up, right? Even when people told him not to, because like he's a man. He's like, I'm a man, so I gotta fight, and I gotta fight, no matter what, even if I'm, the weaker one. So he fights against Bacchus, right? He was the strongest member of his guild, and they're like, I don't know if you can do this, because like magically he's like not that good at doing his takeovers and shit, right? And he's like, but I've been training and other things. You gotta just, let me handle this shit. So my guildmate can't do it, so I'm gonna step up and do this shit. You need me to do this, I'll do it. And he's like, he's in that fight, and it's tough for him too. It is, but he's the last one standing when it's all said and done. And they're like, okay, Elfman, you did your job, And it's like this guy, he's very like manly and shit. And that's a Taurus trait. Male Tauruses be like that. They be, I'm a real man. That kind of thing. Um, I protect these females. I do this. I do that. But sometimes you know the magic really like gets to him though. He's not the best magic user, but he's like physically a strong guy, and like when you look at him, he has muscles and shit. And he's like physically he's like that's why Evergreen fucks with his dick, because he looks good, right? And that's the thing about Taurus males like me, they have an aesthetic that females like, um, very fit, very physically appealing. Now we got Gajeel. He is a June 6th Gemini. He's a June 6th Gemini. So this guy likes to kind of talk shit sometimes, right? So he was a big shit talker at the beginning of the series, right? Boom, you fairy losers, I'll beat your ass. I'll, show you why you're, puny, weak. And he was backing it up, but like at the same time, he was, you know, I'm saying he was smart about how he was doing it because he was trying to prove himself right? So he was beating on the weaker members because doing that, you know, he's spitting facts, But then when the big boys come, like Natsu, it's not the same story. At first it looked like it was, but then, Natsu's emotional amps, kick in and, he ends up winning. And then, fire and metal, we know that fire beats metal, right? So he wasn't going to win that. Then he, like, gets to know the guild and shit. And he does a little number sometimes. He's called Mr. Shooby-Doo Boss, so he gets on and he does some karaoke every once in a while. And that's the Gemini thing. They like to, try to, talk different ways, And he fights with, Natsus here and there because, he has a mouth and he does too. But he's like, that guy. He's cool. He's like able to get information. Like he was used as a double agent too. See, he was used by Makarov to like spy on Ivan, his son. He wants to get his hands on the luminous dwarf, and he's letting Makarov know that. He's like, your son started his own guild, and he's trying to like get his hands on the like some power that you have. I don't know all the details, but he wants that, and he's like letting him know. He's like a double agent. Gemini the twins. He can seem cool, but he's really cool with you don't know who he's cool with, but he's cool with Fairy Tale now, and he fell in love with a bookworm too, and Levy, she's a girl who likes to go and read books and shit, and he fell in love with her, because like they like that kind of thing. They like people who are intelligent. That's a Gemini thing. Cana Alberona, she was born December 5th, right? She's a Sagittarius, right? She don't give a fuck, basically, right? So she will pour herself a drink and like then some, because like it's fire, right? And they tend to go overboard. They do, whether they admit it or not. Some of them don't give a fuck. They're like, and she wouldn't give a fuck, right? She's like, yeah, I got another barrel, and that barrel's mine, and that one's mine too. And that one's mine too. And she's like, just like she's gone and shit, right? She's like, she gets challenged to a drinking contest during the Grand Magic Games, and she's, up against, Bacchus, who's a drinker. Like, he gets better at fighting as he drinks. So she thought she was gonna win because she's like, well, I have experience. I've been drinking for a while and shit. I have, my guts are ready for this shit. She ends up losing that though. She's like, damn, and she, gets in these fights too. She'll fight. She has a move called fairy glitter, and she's like, I'll, come to you guys' aid and, hit them with this, She comes up like randomly too sometimes. Like when Lucy was fighting against Brandish, she came in there and she was like, boom, I hit her with, I trapped her in the card, now she can't do anything. Quick, saved her, you know, like that, and Sagittarius can be like that sometimes. They can be really, quick about seizing the opportunity. She's like that, man. She's one of those types. And then the last one I have for today is Juvia. Juvia Laxus. She is a November 13th Scorpio. This girl feels deeply and loves deeply. And it to the point where it's an obsession, right? And it's like over the top, But like she's also a Scorpio, right? So she has that jealousy there too. So she likes Gray. She's cooking these, little treats and making them look like Gray and other things. Like, okay, you like me, I get it, and all that, right? She's always trying to get close to him and other things, like spying on him, stalking him, and that's the type of shit that these bitches do when they like you. And she does that shit to Gray all the time, right? But then the jealousy factor of Scorpio, which there's deep jealousy there too. Anytime he's just sitting by a girl and he's just talking, because he's an Aquarius, so he can like have a conversation with just about anybody. So he's like, "Oh yeah, Lucy, I agree with that." Da, 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 da. And from her perspective, it's like, "Oh my God, I have to, get rid of Lucy. I have to get rid of Erza, or, And she's like, "Oh my God," and her emotions are just going fucking crazy, right? Because of her obsession with him, and she, gets like that. And she, at certain times hates other people and other things. But like, it's also crazy. Like these bitches, like, they when they like somebody, they go deep. Because basically, she gave her life for Gray during Alvarez, right? Boom, she stabs herself because he's like, either he kills himself, or you kill yourself, or you both kill each other, because the chain was around their neck and they would, basically they couldn't control their bodies. And she was just like, she spent no time thinking. She was just like, my love, you have to live. You have to live, and she has like deep love for Gray. And, Gray was like, he felt so bad after that, because he is that kind of distant guy and other things. And he never really got to tell her, because he got to the point where he was like, comfortable with her, but he didn't get to tell her, how he felt. So he got emotionally amped after this. Luckily for him, she was still alive and another thing. I mean, this is fairy tale, by the way. But yeah, she definitely shows signs of being a Scorpio, with that obsession and that jealousy factor. And then, she'll die for, the shit she, cares for. And that is the members of fairy tale and their astrology signs, their sun signs. Be cool, call in the corner, and let me know what you think about this video. And do you have the same signs or the same birthdays as any of these characters? I know I didn't, but I'm glad that Elfman's, real man. He's a Taurus, like me, strong and other things. But let me know what you found out in this video and what you like about these characters in the comments.